All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to this comprehensive explainer charting the absolutely massive, magnificent artistic traditions of Asia and the ancient Near East. If you're fascinated by how human culture has expressed itself visually over thousands of years, well, you are definitely in the right place today. We're going to examine how vastly different environments, from the sweeping wide-open steppes to incredibly dense river valleys, shaped some of the most extraordinary art the world has ever seen.
Think about this quote for a second. Recognizability lay under the surface, veiled in mist. That perfectly captures the aesthetic depth of Far Eastern ink landscapes. When we dive into the great age of ink landscape painting in places like Japan and China, creating a specific mood was way more important than drawing objects precisely. Artists like the highly versatile master Sesshu would use these irregular, overlapping ink washes and scattered linear accents. Their goal wasn't to give you a perfect high-definition photograph of a mountain. Not at all. It was to stimulate your imagination and evoke a really profound sense of harmony with nature.
Because we are covering a huge chunk of history today, here's our roadmap. We'll be hitting 1. Spirituality in East Asian art. 2. God Kings of Southeast Asia. 3. Nomadic arts of Central Asia. 4. The sacred art of Tibet. 5. Japanese and Korean traditions. And finally, 6. The ancient Near East. Let's get going.
Starting off with Section 1, Spirituality in East Asian Art, focusing on harmony and sublimity. So, kicking off our journey in China, we are looking at what is arguably the oldest continuous artistic tradition in the world. Unlike the West, which went through the collapse of the Roman Empire and had this slow, painful recovery of classical styles, Chinese art just kept going, maintaining incredible continuity across millennia, deeply influenced by shifting philosophies. Take the Song Dynasty, for instance. Art became highly impressionistic. This was the era that gave us sea poetry, which let writers express desires through adopted personas, and also kunku opera. But in their landscape painting, artists heavily favored spiritual harmony over emotional realism. They actually preferred blurred outlines to convey vast distances and deep spiritual meaning. Then, as we move into the Yuan Dynasty, you have artists like Zhao Mengfu, who refined that landscape tradition, while those earlier operatic styles evolved to lay the actual groundwork for modern Cantonese opera. Moving on to Section 2, the God Kings of Southeast Asia, specifically the Khmer Empire. Shifting south to Cambodia, we find this incredibly rich tradition built on a fascinating syncretism. It's the seamless blending of indigenous animistic beliefs with Indian Buddhism and Hinduism. And a massive outcome of that blend was the cult of the Deva-raja, or the God King. Khmer sculpture wasn't just there to look pretty. It was a highly organized, highly effective political tool. Since the aristocrats were literally viewed as living gods, artists didn't just churn out idealized stereotypes. Instead, they treated their subjects with intense realism and originality because, well, they were depicting living models. This art provided tangible visual proof of their divine right to rule, immortalizing the kings in these elegant dresses and extravagant jewelry. What's amazing is how the Khmer Empire slowly assimilated foreign influence before just exploding into its own unique stylistic perfection. Back in the 1st century, Indian culture reached the region via seafaring merchants trading with China. But skip ahead to the 7th century, and Khmer artists are confidently drifting away from those early Hindu and Buddhist influences. By the time we hit the 9th to 13th centuries, this constant stylistic evolution hit its absolute peak at Angkor. It evolved into this eminently aristocratic art where small groups of elite artists literally competed with each other to achieve this hypothetical perfection of style. All right, Section 3, the nomadic arts of Central Asia out on the steppes. Let's travel west now into the steppes. Here we encounter the visual and musical arts created by the largely Turkic peoples of Central Asia, spanning modern-day Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and beyond. Now, because their whole lifestyle was nomadic, their art had to be inherently portable and super practical. You aren't going to find massive stone palaces here. Instead, you find incredibly intricate embroidered carpets, beautifully thick quilts, and carved doors that were built specifically for temporary, movable dwellings. On top of that, this region is famous for its classical musical instruments like the rubab and the dombra. And because these nomadic tribes sat smack dab on the Silk Road, their highly portable art became this massive attraction factor. It heavily influenced international art forms, blending seamlessly with Chinese, Greek, and Persian traditions along the way. Next up is Section 4, the sacred art of Tibet and Vajrayana Buddhism. Heading way up into the extreme altitudes of the Himalayas, we find an art form that is entirely driven by the spiritual needs of Vajrayana Buddhism. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to understand the concept of the Yidam, or the meditation Buddha. Take the deity Chenrezig, for example. He's often depicted as a thousand-armed saint with an eye right in the palm of every single hand. It's a powerful representation of the all-seeing, compassionate one who hears all requests. So this elaborate tantric art isn't just symbolic. It serves as a direct, functional aid for complex meditational visualizations. It's literally a tool for spiritual practice. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. At first glance, Tantric Buddhism can appear downright terrifying. It heavily utilizes these wrathful deities with angry faces, intense circles of flame, and literal skulls of the dead. But here's the twist. While these protectors look frightening, they're actually meant to portray a fierce compassion. The practitioner uses these terrifying images to conquer their own negative psychological attitudes and to protect their specific tantric practices from corruption. That intense wrath actually belies a really deep dedication to protecting the Dharma. Zooming out to the macro philosophy of the region, we have to talk about the sand mandala. Monks will spend countless hours painstakingly creating these intricate geometric patterns, grain by brightly colored grain. It takes incredible focus. But after the accompanying ceremonies are finished, the final and most crucial step is its systematic destruction. The sand is completely swept away. It acts as this profound, highly physical symbol for the transitory nature of all material things. In the Buddhist canon, absolutely nothing material is permanent, and this art form embodies that truth perfectly by ultimately destroying its own masterpiece. All right, Section 5, Japanese and Korean Traditions, Exploring Assimilation and Uniqueness. Traveling further east, we get to examine the fiercely independent cultures of Japan and Korea. Both of these regions interacted deeply with Chinese influence, but forged completely distinct identities of their own. Japan's artistic evolution is just staggering, covering everything from ancient pottery right up to incredible innovations in printmaking. During the metropolitan culture of Edo, which is what we now call Tokyo, printmaking absolutely exploded. Back in the 1670s, artists were just using single-color India ink. But by the 18th century, massive innovators like Suzuki Harinobu developed complex techniques for polychrome printing. These full-color Nishiki-e prints were a total game-changer. They completely transformed the visual landscape with these brilliant, widely accessible works of art. And looking at Korea, we really need to set the historical record straight here. The old Western view sort of just assumed that due to its geography, Korea was merely a conduit, just a bridge passing Chinese culture directly over to Japan. But modern scholars firmly reject that. They recognize that Korea certainly assimilated influences, but it birthed an entirely unique aesthetic. Korean art is defined by these incredibly bold colors, very specific shapes and scales in its pottery, and stunning surface decorations rooted deeply in natural forms. It wasn't just a bridge, folks. It was a profound cultural destination in its own right. And finally, Section 6, the Ancient Near East, often called the Cradle of Civilization. We're wrapping up our journey by landing in the modern Middle East, stretching from Turkey all the way to the Indus River Valley. This is a region of absolute extreme contrasts. You have incredibly arid deserts sitting right next to super fertile river valleys. And that geography allowed for intensive year-round agriculture, which in turn birthed the very first dense urban settlements. And naturally, with crowded cities came the need for extreme innovation and massive organization. This is exactly where we see the first writing systems created just to keep records. We see law codes written to govern exploding populations, the very first currency, and yes, the invention of the wheel. The sheer scale of advancement here literally laid the foundation for modern human society. Consider how dramatically the function of art shifted as these early societies evolved. Back in the 3000s BCE, Sumerian art was deeply foundational and highly religious. They created cuneiform writing and built these massive pyramid-like ziggurat temples just to honor the divine. But fast forward to 2350 BCE, and the Akkadians crash onto the scene as conquerors. Their art reflects an absolute, unyielding consolidation of power. Take the victory stele of Naram Sin, for example. It literally celebrates the ruler's violent conquest in stone and visually elevates the king himself right up to the level of a god. So whether it was the tiniest cylinder seal or the largest palace wall, the overarching function of ancient Near Eastern art was incredibly serious. It focused heavily on human relationships with the divine, and it was intensely political. Get this, though. Sheer artistic skill and technique were actually valued far more than individual originality.
Artists weren't there to express themselves. They were tasked with showing off flawless execution to cement the authority, the strength, and the divine right to rule of their kings. They often did this using monumental relief carvings that stood out in dramatic 3D right from flat stone surfaces. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to reflect on this massive contrast we've explored today. On one hand, we've seen Tibetan monks spend weeks creating a delicate masterpiece, only to immediately wipe it away to prove that absolutely nothing lasts. And on the other hand, we've seen Akkadian kings permanently carve their faces into stone mountains, specifically so they would be remembered forever. Yet, despite these wildly different approaches, these cultures use their art to answer the exact same fundamental human questions. How do we relate to the divine? How do we understand our place in the natural world? And how do we define power? Thank you so much for exploring these incredible traditions with me today. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.